on to our next presentation, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Like Gobeawan, computer scientist at A-Star Institute of High Performance Computing. After obtaining degrees in computer science and engineering at Nanyang Technological University and postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University, Dr. Gobeawan has been a computer scientist at A-Star's Institute of High Performance Computing for over 10 years. Pursuing her passion in computer graphics, she works on diverse R&D projects in 3D modeling, physics-based simulation, game development, path planning, and geometry processing. For the past few years, she has been focusing on thematic research of urban modeling, especially trees and their interactions with the environment. Her work involves translating botany to computer science, automating the 3D modeling of millions of urban vegetation at the species level, along with their growth patterns, individual traits, and locations. She envisions the creation of dynamic 3D vegetation model contents that will have far-reaching impact on real-life applications, such as environmental and ecological analysis, greenery and urban planning, agriculture experiments, and even in digital entertainment. Now, hence today, she continues to engage and collaborate with potential stakeholders, fellow researchers, and relevant agencies to bring the works to real-life use cases. Her topic today, 3D urban tree modeling for environmental studies. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Dr. Gobeawan.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. So I think I will keep this as brief as possible because lunch is waiting outside, right? So I just think that I heard Mr. Eugene's talk just now. I'm very intrigued on like how all of those platforms will be able to actually house the data sets that he's mentioning. So just to mention this, so the talk is really on the creation of the data itself, mainly the trees. And this is like one of the motivation of us doing this work in the first place. Like for now, like why are we doing tree modeling in the first place? So we saw a lot of works going on buildings, trying to make. We used to want to do like digital twin cities, try to make a copy of everything in real life. For example, in Singapore, for Virtual Singapore, we do a lot of buildings, try to mimic them to multiple level of details. So this is what we want to address in this digital twin cities, specifically on the trees. So there are many ways of looking at these trees, modeling it, and there are different challenges. So we also want to model them at a different level of details. So I think today I just want to actually share with you like the motivation, the challenges in this tree modeling, what is our approach in general, and then some of the use cases. What does tree modeling in urban setting for digital twin especially. So yeah, so as I mentioned briefly just now, we do have digital twin city. So we do agree that there are many use of having this digital twin city that have a lot of many urban furnitures, but often case they are all mostly static, I'll say, in comparison with the trees. Vegetation, because they are organic. So there are millions of trees in Singapore. We are trying to get into the nature and city for Singapore, where we want the trees and the vegetation to be part of our city. So you can imagine that in order to model these trees, it's actually to represent them in this digital twin city is really challenging because they are actually very dynamic. They grow at most of the time and they interact very closely with the environment. Yeah, so we can say that if we can model the tree very closely to them, then we will get to reap a lot of benefits in terms of environmental simulations, city planning, agricultural, food agriculture, education, entertainment, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I mean, like we just like we kind of mentioned a lot of benefits that we can get with this tree models. So this is now we are going into the challenges of what these tree models have in the first place. So first, as I mentioned, it's very dynamic. They have the tree grow all the time, and you know that there are so many varieties, so many species of the trees. They behave differently towards wind, for example, or towards the temperature, the buildings, and so on. And most importantly is that the tree also interact very closely with the environment. So in order to model trees, we do have to consider how to actually incorporate all those challenges that address these challenges. So the problem statement right now is how to actually generate these tree models to represent the actual trees in the city. So that to be that there are these four focus that I actually would like to highlight. That first is that how we can actually model them to the species level. So we know that there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of species in the world, and still counting, and many more. So how we can actually capture those species differences in our tree models. And then at the same time capture their dynamic tree growth, which grow differently. And also we want to see how we can scale this to model the entire ecosystem of the trees in the city, for example, in Singapore. So we're looking at how we can best maintain them over time, and how we can actually generate them in large scale. So we also want to enable extension to new species. So we don't want to just like focus on certain species and we're done with modeling, for example, just 10 species of the trees, and then we are left with hundreds and thousands of new species that's left to be modeled. So we want this kind of flexibility. Yeah. So this picture, as you see, is actually the picture of the early days of Virtual Singapore's pictures by the salt system. So this is the kind of thing that we actually foresee that our tree model will be able to be loaded onto this kind of a platform in large scale. And just for your information, so the current system usually treat tree models as a static models, so they don't really grow over time. They are just like there for mostly for visual representation. So this is something that we want to change and actually give more meanings to the tree models. Yeah. So so this is I think to give you some overall framework of how we try to approach this problem is that we actually takes the input of remote sensing. So in this case, actually it can be either satellite imagery or LiDAR scans, laser scans. But in this case, we actually, for this particular work that we do as a start, we actually take those mobile LiDAR scans, which is done by SLA, our government agency. In actually, they are trying to map the whole Singapore. So we, in this case, we take away, we extracted the three parts of it, and then try to model them, make them as similar, to make it actually resemble the actual tree that we see at a certain location in Singapore. Yeah. And then using those remote sensing input, extracting it, we actually also collaborate with NCARS, which actually provide us with the botanical, the arborist knowledge, domain knowledge of how trees actually grow. And with this, we actually sort of present, incorporate all this data, so-called tree architecture knowledge into our model to see like how certain species will grow under certain branching pattern, or how they are supposed to grow, how fast they are supposed to grow, and based on also certain field measurements, limited field measurements. So the idea here is that we want to make use of the well-known universal botanical domain knowledge, augmented with limited amount of field measurements or observation that we all know, and then use those to actually come up with the 3D models of the trees. So in this case, what you see here is these are actually Singapore's top 10 most common tree species in Singapore. So if you see, the first thing you can say is that, oh wait, this is actually look very simple, and it doesn't maybe look as real. But I think the main emphasis that we want to say here is that we are trying to mimic their branching pattern. So in this case, we want to, as a start, I guess we can say it's a start that we actually ignore those seasonal components of the trees, such as leaves or flowers, fruits, and so on, epiphytes, and so on. So what we want to look at is those woody components of the trees that doesn't change and will remain the same throughout the years. So this is very, very, this is like a baseline of our model. And with this, we are trying to capture how the branching skeleton of trees for each species is. So these are 10 species for Singapore, and how fast they grow, or what is the size and measurements of them. We actually simulate this based on a little experiments, observation from across the streets that our team are actually doing over time. Yeah. So this is the additional picture here, over here. So I don't really have animation of it. So it actually is supposed to grow over time. So what happened is that this green shadow area is supposed to be is actually the growing space that we derive from the LiDAR scans. So this means that this is like the actual scans of a tree in a street, for example, and then our tree model actually is grown inside it to try to match to fit to try to find the best fit that will be able to fill up this space the best as we can, and this is how we can come up with the species model that is very similar to the actual tree in the field. So as simple as this looks like, actually it involves a lot of parameters that we have to actually optimize over time to try to fit this. So in this case, alone, without using any high performance computing or any parallel computing, just like a normal, maybe a normal laptop and normal PC, it will actually take about 2 to 3 days just to come up with one tree. So you imagine that if we want to do this for millions of trees of Singapore alone, you can imagine that that's going to take forever, and that's not something that is feasible. So in this case, we really need to look at more at optimizing all this kind of works, especially by like the HPC resources. Yep. Right. So the next thing. I won't be going through the technical details of it, of our approach. If you are interested, we can always let you know on the details of it. So I just want to talk about some of the use cases that we have been doing, or our collaborators have been doing so far with the models, the tree models. So in this case, I identify like there are about 4 categories so far. So first is the tree management. And then there's also environmental simulations, green building designs, and finally, but not the least, is actually the most important thing is the socio-economic impact studies of trees to us. Yep. So for tree management, this is mainly NParks, driven by NParks effort. So what they basically do, they are using this digital twin tree models, mainly like for tree inventory, tree inspection, for health and safety of the tree, safety of the roads as well. So in this case, we are actually looking at using all those remote sensing inputs, and then try to actually track what are the trees that is in Singapore, and how are they healthy? Are they posing any kind of safety hazard or not? And then biodiversity. So just to highlight, one of the interesting part here is that in the current or all practices or all days of how NParks manage the trees are there, is that they actually maintain it like very simple, like maybe like Excel sheet, and then location of the trees are determined by like for example next to which lamp post in Singapore and so on. So it's really pretty still there are much more potential of digitalizing this effort, and by digitalizing this one, we can actually save a lot of labor, manual efforts that has been going just to maintain the trees around Singapore, right? So in this case, the maintenance is really one of the area that will benefit a lot from this digitalization effort. And of course, there is also interactions with the environment, like for example, the neighboring trees and the building structure, the traffic and the human activities for their pruning activity and so on. And this one is another very interesting studies that IHPC as well as NUS and HDB has been doing on this simulation of environmental simulation. And then here we see that what you see here is that we use these tree models, the species models that we generated, and then they printed in 3D, and they put it in the wind tunnel, trying to find out what is the wind load for different species of trees in the street context and so on. And hopefully this one will actually give us an idea of well, what is the if there is any tree fall risk and so on, and not only this one, but for other environmental studies such as like shading, air cooling, air pollution, and many more that we can think of. So environmental, like depending on like how good your tree models is, the more simulation that we can get from. And this is another one of the use cases that we've done so far. Also, so this one is with NUS and URA as well, and also the landscape architect, Singapore Landscape Architect group. So what we are trying to do here is to enable the tree models within the BIM models, BIM workflow. So we know that in order to for building to be submitted for approval, they involve like designing the tree model, designing the buildings right before submission, and then there is this so-called green plot ratio that they want to achieve for certain buildings, like how much greenery is involved in the tree in the building designs. And this is where our we try to incorporate those tree models onto the building designs as well. And there will be many advantages as well for virtual landscaping, for example. And the work is actually still in progress, and I think it's going to be very useful to marry this vegetation models with the buildings in the urban setting. And finally, is this socio-economic impact studies of tree models. So this what I show here is actually our collaborators from NTU. They are doing work on studying the noise absorption in their campus setting. So hopefully such socio-economic studies will be more enabled just by incorporating the tree models and in this urban mapping and that we have. Yeah, and air pollution and tree and soil root conditions as well. So this is something that we would really like to look at in future with many more such use cases. Yeah, so as I say, actually this is like this tree models actually is very complicated, and there are many aspects, there are many interesting aspects that we have yet to address. So one of the things that we are currently working with is the automation, so the full automation with data science and AI at the moment, like how we can, for example, for species recognition, how we can automate it, for example, just from the remote sensing. And then also how can we are actually currently looking at how to model the tree interactions with the environments, for example, the sunlight, the gravity, and the tree pruning and the building structures and walls, neighboring trees, and so on. Yeah. So yeah, we have to acknowledge. So this is like non-exhaustive. Actually, there are many more, but this is like some of the government agencies that we have collaborated in, and we are actually without all of us working together, I think the work might not be able to progress as much as we want. Yeah. So yes, we would like to thank our collaborators, and hopefully we can move on again and continue this work in the urban setting. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Gobeawan, for participating here for a moment. So let's start this question, right? You know, like you said, trees are organic.
Yes.
In this case, when you model a tree, what's the accuracy like?
So the accuracy, it really depends on first, like for example, our remote sensing data, like what kind of level of details they are able to give us. So for example, if let's just say they are in terms of like maybe 10 cm or 20 cm, then that's how our the level of details that we might be able to model it. So our synthesized model, in a sense, it can actually it can go at any level of detail. It's very detailed, like it can go with considering all components of the trees. But then again, in order for it to match to get the similarity, level of similarity with the input, in this case is the remote sensing data, then it really depends on the remote sensing data level. But speaking of that, despite of that, the kind of model that we can still derive will be still very detailed. In fact, it's so detailed that actually when we are trying to incorporate this whole millions of models, it might not be like the resource might not be enough anyway. Okay. So yeah, so I think that is some kind of like a trade-off that we really have to think about, like which one we want to go with.
I understand. Yes. So you know, because like for example, when you're driving, you see on the roads, right? Like my point is, when do NParks know when to trim the trees? You know, if you have such a model, right, the NParks will actually know, hey, this time we can just go and trim the trees because you know the model predicts this, right? Okay, great. So open the floor to questions. Any questions from the floor? Anyone? So yes, come.
So maybe just a question.
Sure.
Initially, I was kind of wondering how you managed to identify species when you get this huge amount of data from LiDAR satellites, right?
Sure.
But then you mentioned that you're planning to do some kind of like automation with science and AI.
Right.
Right.
So
I was just wondering that right now, before you're using AI, what kind of method that I'm using to identify species?
Okay, sure. So maybe there are two parts of answering this question. So what is the current or the initial way of us identifying the species is that actually NPARKs have their own database of telling us like, okay, here at this position, this scan is supposed to be species X, for example. So then we know that it's that species and then we grow the tree according to that species. But then our approach actually, they take into account the knowledge domain of the botany. So what happened is that we actually takes in all those measurements and observations from those remote sensing data. And then we sort of have this species profile template that actually by having the details in this species profile, we are actually able to tell what species they are. And it actually, in fact, we don't really need to know what species they are per se, but as long as we have their profile, then we actually grow it accordingly. So in this case, when we mention AI, we want to automate how we profile those trees from the remote sensing data and to get those species profile information so that we can model it automatically. And maybe even like know when, oh, we found a new species that's not been there before. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, just a small question. Does that mean that you need an expert to actually identify what kind of species that terms? Manually checking one by one?
Manually, yes. So when we talk about species identification as per botanist identification, it's actually very, very complicated, I would say. And it's not just based on the patterns of the branch alone. They do have many procedure, so-called, to identify it. But when we're talking about species identification based on the morphology, the outer appearance of it, we do it so-called manually by saying, okay, I see, for example, I say, okay, the branches, the pattern looks like this. So this is how I actually identify or profile those species. Yeah. So in that case, it is manual that way. Yes.
Thank you for the question. Any other question? Let's go. Okay, no, please join me. Thank you very much, Dr. Gobeawan. Thank you.